The first drop landed softly on the dusty window pane. Then came another. And another. Soon, the little town of Fernville was wrapped in a gentle rain. It wasn't the kind of storm that shouted. It was the kind that whispered. The kind that made people light candles, pull blankets over their knees, and speak in softer voices. At the edge of Maple Street, tucked between a quiet bookstore and an old-fashioned barber shop, stood a tiny bakery called Willow and Whisk. The building itself was nothing grand. It was made of red brick, with ivy climbing the sides and a crooked chimney that puffed out little clouds of cinnamon-scented smoke. But when the rain came, the bakery became something else entirely. A refuge. A hug made of butter and sugar. Inside, the lights were golden and warm. The scent of rising dough filled the air, rich with vanilla, clove, and melted chocolate. Trays of fresh pastries cooled on the counters, and the oven hummed in the background like a lullaby. At the center of it all was Ella. She stood behind the counter in a flour-dusted apron, a wooden spoon resting behind her ear like a pencil. Her hair was tied back loosely, wisps of it escaping to frame her face. She was humming. Not a full song, just a soft tune she had carried with her since childhood. Ella loved the rain. Not just the sound of it or the way it made everything smell cleaner, but what it brought with it. The stillness. The way people slowed down. How they lingered. How they stayed. She was preparing a fresh batch of honey butter scones when the door creaked open. The bell above it jingled, and a gust of damp, pine-scented air followed someone inside. Ella glanced up and smiled. It was Mrs. Keller from down the road, wrapped in her thick gray coat, her glasses fogged at the edges. "Raining already," Mrs. Keller said as she pushed back her hood. "I barely made it here dry." Ella handed her a warm cloth to dry her hands. "That's what we're here for. Rain and refuge." Mrs. Keller chuckled. "And something sweet for my husband's tea, if you've got it." Ella handed her a small paper box filled with lemon shortbread. As they chatted, more people trickled in. A man from the newspaper office. A group of teenage girls escaping the cold. A mother with her sleepy toddler. The bakery filled with the sound of wet shoes on tile, laughter, and the quiet comfort of being somewhere warm. Ella watched them all with a kind of quiet joy. She had always wanted this. Not just a bakery, but a space that felt like a warm kitchen on a gray afternoon. A place people could return to. And Fernville needed it. The town was small, the kind where everyone knew everyone's dog, everyone's favorite pie, and everyone's heartbreak. It didn't have fancy cafes or big stores. But it had stories. And kindness. And people who knew the importance of a good loaf of bread. Just as Ella was wiping down the counter, the door opened once more. This time, it wasn't someone familiar. A man stepped in, soaking wet. He stood awkwardly at the entrance, his shoulders hunched, his coat dripping onto the mat. His hair was dark and messy, stuck to his forehead, and his boots were muddy. He looked lost. Ella set down her cloth. "Come in," she said gently. "You look like you've walked through a river." He smiled faintly. "Felt like it." She pointed to the empty stool by the window. "Sit. I'll bring you something warm." He didn't argue. He just moved slowly to the stool, his movements quiet and unsure. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the shelves of jam jars, the baskets of rolls, the tiny chalkboard with today's special, cinnamon raisin swirls written in neat letters. Ella brought over a mug of hot apple cider and a small plate with one of her cinnamon rolls. "No charge," she said. He looked at the food, then at her. "Are you always this kind to strangers?" Ella shrugged. "Only on rainy days." He smiled again, just a little more this time. "Then I picked the right day to show up." She walked back to the counter but kept an eye on him. He ate slowly, like someone who hadn't tasted real food in days. Not in a desperate way, but in the way people eat when they've forgotten what comfort tastes like. After a while, he looked up. "This is the best thing I've had in a long time." Ella leaned on the counter, elbows on the wood. "It's the butter. And a little secret ingredient." He raised an eyebrow. "Secret?" She nodded. "But I'll tell you. Only if you come back tomorrow." There was a pause. Then he said, "All right. It's a deal." Outside, the rain thickened. Inside, the lights glowed warmer. And somewhere between the clink of his fork and the hum of the oven, something shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But like the first drop of rain on a dry roof. The rain did not let up. It had been falling for hours now, soft, steady, and rhythmic. Fernville's streets had emptied. The town square, usually scattered with children riding bicycles and neighbors watering their garden pots, now lay quiet. The only sounds were the wind brushing against windows and the patter of raindrops on rooftops. Inside Willow and Whisk, it was warm enough to forget the world outside. Ella stood near the oven, watching the timer count down. The scent of rosemary focaccia filled the room, a savory change from the morning sweets. She leaned against the counter, staring out the window, where the man from earlier still sat. He hadn't left. His plate was empty now, but he had asked for a second cider and just sat there, watching the rain as if it were telling him something only he could hear. Ella approached slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Everything all right?" she asked. He nodded. "It's peaceful here." "Most days are," she said softly. "Especially when the clouds come in." He looked at her for a moment, as if debating something. Then he said, "I'm Noah." It took Ella a moment to realize he was introducing himself. She smiled. "Ella?" They shook hands briefly, his warm despite the rain. Noah looked down at his mug. "I didn't mean to take up space. I just didn't want to go home yet." Ella sat on the stool across from him. "Sometimes, this is the place people come to when they have nowhere else they want to be." He gave a short, quiet laugh. "You get a lot of that?" She nodded. "More than you'd think. Rain has a way of showing people what they're really feeling." He didn't reply, but the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was soft, like the hush that comes after a deep breath. She didn't ask where he came from, or what he was running from. She didn't have to. People don't sit in silence unless their minds are already loud. He turned toward the window. "I used to think I loved the city. The speed. The noise. All of it. But lately, I just wanted something slower." "Well," Ella said, gesturing around the room, "you found it." Noah smiled. Ella stood, brushing flour from her apron. "I've got to check the bread. But you can stay as long as you like." He nodded. "Thanks, Ella." As she walked back toward the kitchen, she found herself glancing over her shoulder. There was something about Noah, something weighed down. like he carried a backpack full of memories and didn't know where to set it down. Back behind the counter, she pulled out the rosemary focaccia, golden and crackling at the edges. She sliced off a corner and placed it on a plate with olive oil and sea salt, then brought it over to him. "Try this," she said. "Made it for lunch service, but you look like someone who hasn't eaten real food in days." He tried it and his eyebrows raised with the first bite. "This is ridiculous," he muttered through a mouthful. "I don't know how food can feel like a blanket." Ella laughed. "That's the magic of baking." Noah looked up. "You always wanted to be a baker?" She leaned on the table, thinking. "Not always. I used to draw blueprints. Architecture. Buildings. Then I realized I wanted to build something people could come into and feel something right away. Not cold steel. Not glass. Warmth. Comfort?" He nodded slowly, chewing another bite. "You did that? This place. It's like it was waiting for people like me." That stayed with her. Even long after he left, just before closing, Ella kept thinking about what he said. The way his voice dipped when he talked about leaving the city. The distant look in his eyes. The way he never said where home was. After locking the door, she swept the floor, wiped the counters, and stared out into the quiet rain. She thought about her own first day in Fernville. How strange it felt. How unfamiliar. And how one rainy evening, she'd stepped into the local grocer's, dripping wet, and someone had handed her a cup of tea without saying a word. It had stayed with her, too. Sometimes all it takes is one quiet act to make a place feel like home. The morning came with more rain. Not pouring, but soft and persistent. The kind of rain that made the leaves shimmer and the earth smell alive. The townspeople of Fernville knew better than to fight it. They wore boots and long coats, walked slowly under umbrellas, and accepted the gray skies like an old friend who always visited this time of year. Inside Willow and Whisk, Ella was up before dawn. The bakery was silent except for the low hum of the oven and the soft shuffle of her slippers on the wooden floor. She moved through her routine with ease, measuring flour, folding dough, slicing apples for tarts, and mixing her signature vanilla glaze in a ceramic bowl. The shop still felt full from the day before. Even though everyone had gone home and the chairs had been tucked back in place, something lingered in the air. Maybe it was the cinnamon. Maybe it was the quiet laughter. Maybe it was Noah's voice, soft and hesitant, still echoing in the corners. When she walked to the window to adjust the curtain, she noticed something leaning by the door. A black umbrella. It was old, but sturdy. The handle was wooden and worn smooth from use. She recognized it right away. Noah had forgotten it. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected. There was a small, faded sticker on the handle, a tiny red heart. The kind children stick on their notebooks. She set it carefully behind the counter. By 7 o'clock, the lights were on, the coffee was brewed, and a tray of lemon blueberry muffins was cooling near the register. Mrs. Keller came in first, as usual. "Still raining," she muttered, shaking out her umbrella. "This storm doesn't want to leave." Ella smiled. "Some guests tend to linger." Mrs. Keller pointed toward the counter. "That new boy from yesterday, he leave his umbrella." "Looks like it." "Humph," Mrs. Keller said, selecting a muffin. "Maybe he left it on purpose." Ella raised an eyebrow. Why would he do that? Mrs. Keller gave her a look that only women over 70 could give. Because he wants a reason to come back, dear. Ella laughed and rang her up. By mid-morning, the bakery was alive again. Locals came in for hot drinks and warm pastries, using the rain as an excuse to indulge. A small group of high school students gathered near the fireplace, whispering about tests and crushes and weekend plans. Two women sat by the window with knitting needles, chatting between rows of yarn. But Ella kept glancing at the door. Waiting. Wondering. Noah didn't come. By noon, the rain had grown heavier. Drops streaked down the window in long lines. A delivery van parked outside, its headlights barely cutting through the fog. Ella served lunch, a broccoli cheddar soup with thick slices of garlic toast, and refilled the sugar jar. But every time the door creaked open, her heart skipped. And every time it wasn't him, it settled again, disappointed. At 3, she finally gave up watching the door. Instead, she took the umbrella from behind the counter and placed it gently by the front window. Just in case he walked by. Just in case he saw it. As the afternoon wore on, the bakery emptied. The rain fell louder. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. Ella was closing early. Rain like this made people stay home. She began wiping down the tables, her apron dusted with flour and sugar, when the bell above the door chimed. She turned around. It was him. Noah stood just inside the doorway, shaking out his hair, his coat dripping with rain. He looked embarrassed. I left my umbrella. She gestured toward the window. I figured. He crossed the room slowly, picking it up. Thank you, he said. I was halfway across town before I realized. She tilted her head. You walked back through this? He gave a sheepish nod. Felt like I had to. There was a pause. Then he added, not just for the umbrella. Ella smiled. Hungry? He looked at her, like he'd been hoping she'd ask. I could eat. She poured him a mug of hot cider and sliced a piece of the still warm apple tart. He took a seat at the counter this time, close to the kitchen, and removed his coat. As he ate, the thunder rolled again, but it sounded softer inside the bakery. More like a purr than a growl. So, Ella said, placing her elbows on the counter, what does a city boy like you do in a town like this? He chewed, then replied, I'm not sure yet. I needed a place to breathe. I had a job I didn't care about. A routine that felt like sleepwalking. Ella nodded. She had seen it before. People didn't just leave cities for fresh air. They left because something in them had cracked open, and the noise no longer drowned it out. I grew up in a town like Fernville, Noah continued. Then I left. Thought I wanted something bigger. Turns out I just wanted something quieter. Ella poured herself a cup of tea and joined him at the counter. You found it, she said. He looked around. Yeah. I think I did. They sat there for a while, side by side, listening to the rain tap against the windows. The kind of silence that didn't need filling. Outside, the world was wet and gray. But inside, under the golden lights and soft hum of the oven, something gentle was beginning. The storm stretched into its third day. By now, Fernville was a painting done entirely in shades of gray and green. The trees dripped with rainwater, puddles mirrored the cloudy skies, and the sidewalks glistened as if someone had carefully polished every stone. People spoke in whispers, moved slower, and lingered longer in doorways. Inside Willow and Whisk, the atmosphere had settled into a calm rhythm. The smell of maple syrup and browned butter floated through the air. A soft instrumental tune played from the radio behind the counter, something with piano and strings, just enough to fill the space without crowding it. Ella was kneeling on the floor of the pantry, sorting through a stack of old wooden boxes she hadn't touched in months. The bakery had quiet moments, especially during rainstorms, and this one was softer than most. She figured it was time to finally go through the collection of recipes her grandmother had left behind. The box was worn at the corners, its lid held together with a strip of faded fabric. When she opened it, the scent of thyme and vanilla hit her like a wave. Handwritten recipe cards were tucked inside, some in her grandmother's elegant script, others smudged and yellowed from years of use. There were notes in the margins, little hearts drawn next to favorite desserts, and once, a faint doodle of a cat next to a scone recipe. Ella smiled as she pulled out a card titled Cloud Bread. It was one of her grandmother's most talked about recipes, light as air, barely sweet, and meant to be eaten warm with a drizzle of honey. But Ella had never made it. She hadn't dared. It felt too sacred, too special. Something reserved for rainy days and tender hearts. She glanced out toward the counter where Noah sat, flipping through a local newspaper someone had left behind. He'd been coming in every day since he first arrived. Never at the same time, never with a plan. But always with that quiet expression, as if he was trying to unlearn something the city had taught him. Ella held the card for a moment, then stood and walked back into the kitchen. She preheated the oven, tied her apron tighter, and gathered the ingredients: egg whites, a pinch of cream of tartar, sugar, and flour. The process was delicate. The batter had to be folded just right. The timing mattered. Outside, the rain came down steadily, tapping a gentle beat against the bakery windows. As she worked, Noah looked up. "What are you making?" he asked, setting down the newspaper. "Something I haven't made before," she replied. "A recipe from my grandmother." He stood and walked over to the counter, watching her fold the batter like it was a sacred ritual. "I didn't realize baking could be this quiet," he said. In the city, kitchens were always loud. Clanging pans. People shouting. Timers going off every minute. Ella looked up, smiling. Here, it's just about listening. To the ingredients. To the moment. He watched her for a while, then said, "You sound like someone who's really at peace." She paused, then said, "I had to work for it. I didn't always feel this way." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was curious. Noah took a seat on the stool near the counter. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The rush. The ambition. The feeling that you're climbing something?" Ella slid the tray into the oven. "Sometimes. But I realized I was climbing a ladder I didn't build. One that didn't go anywhere I actually wanted to be." Noah nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." They let the conversation fade. The rain spoke for them. The smell of the cloud bread began to fill the bakery, sweet and light, almost floral. 15 minutes later, Ella pulled out the tray. The bread had puffed up like golden pillows, soft and round with barely crisp edges. She let them cool for just a minute, then drizzled warm honey over the top. She handed one to Noah without saying a word. He took a bite, and paused. His eyes closed. This? He started, then stopped. This doesn't taste like bread. It tastes like something a dream would taste like. Ella laughed. My grandmother used to say the same thing. They ate quietly, sitting at the counter together, watching the rain race down the window glass. Noah broke the silence again, his voice low. My dad used to take me to a bakery like this when I was a kid, he said. But he wasn't around for long. Work always pulled him somewhere else. Ella looked at him, but didn't interrupt. I think that's why I chased the city for so long, he continued. To prove I could be like him. Important. Busy. Needed. And did it work? Ella asked gently. He shook his head. I just ended up tired. And alone. There was a long pause. Then she said, well, you're not alone now. He looked at her. Really looked at her. No, he said. I guess I'm not. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the warmth from the oven kept the space golden. And for a while, neither of them moved. The world could wait. The storm could last. The bread could cool. But this moment was perfect just as it was. The rain finally paused. It didn't stop completely, but the heavy sheets gave way to a soft drizzle, just enough to blur the glass but not enough to soak through a coat. The sky lightened, and the sun tried its best to peek through the clouds. The streets of Fernville began to stir again. People opened their windows a crack. Wind chimes danced gently. The world was waking up from its rainy sleep. Ella stood at the bakery door, a cup of tea warming her hands. She looked out at the street, noticing how different it looked without the constant curtain of water. Everything was still damp, but glowing. The wet pavement reflected the faint morning light, and the ivy on the bakery's brick wall looked greener than ever. Inside, the bakery was quiet. The early morning crowd hadn't arrived yet. No clinking cups. No chairs scraping the floor. Just the hum of the oven and the soft ticking of the clock on the far wall. Ella walked back toward the kitchen, where she had just finished shaping a batch of cardamom buns. The dough was soft under her fingertips, rising gently in its tray. She dusted the surface with a light coat of flour, then turned toward the counter, and paused. There were footprints. Tiny ones. In the flour that had spilled on the floor. She frowned and crouched down. The prints were light but clear, bare feet, from what she could tell. They led from the side door by the pantry and disappeared behind the curtain that covered the storage shelf. She followed them, curious, her heart beating faster with each step. She pulled back the curtain slowly. And there, huddled behind a stack of crates, was a child. A little girl. Maybe 6, maybe 7. She had tangled hair, a damp jacket, and eyes that looked much too serious for someone her age. Ella knelt down. Hey there. The girl blinked but didn't move. Ella softened her voice. You're not in trouble. I just didn't know anyone was here. The girl didn't speak, but her eyes flicked to the window and then back to Ella. Are you lost? Ella asked. A tiny shake of the head. Ella nodded slowly. Okay. Are you hungry? This time, the girl didn't answer with words, but her stomach did. It growled quietly, the sound breaking the silence between them. Ella stood and extended her hand. Come on. Let's get you something warm. The girl hesitated, then stood and placed her small hand in Ella's. Her fingers were cold. She followed Ella quietly back to the front of the bakery, where Ella pulled out a stool and wrapped her in a clean apron like a blanket. "Hot chocolate?" Ella asked. The girl gave the tiniest nod. Ella worked quickly, steaming milk and adding a spoonful of cocoa, then a swirl of whipped cream. She placed a warm cinnamon bun on a plate beside it and set both in front of her quiet guest. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft clink of the spoon as the girl stirred her drink. Noah arrived not long after. He stepped in, brushing light rain from his jacket, and paused when he saw the girl. Ella looked up and met his eyes. "We have company." He raised an eyebrow, then walked over slowly. The girl looked at him, then quickly looked back down at her cocoa. Noah didn't sit right away. He leaned on the edge of the counter, watching Ella. "Everything okay?" he asked. "She was in the pantry. I don't know how long she'd been there. Looks like she slipped in through the side door." Noah crouched down, staying at a distance. "Hey," he said gently, "I'm Noah." The girl didn't reply. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to." Ella placed another cinnamon bun on a plate and slid it over to him. They sat together in silence for a while, letting the moment breathe. Eventually, the girl looked up. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "My name is Lily." Ella smiled. "That's a beautiful name." Lily looked around the bakery. "This place smells like stories." Ella paused. "What do you mean?" "My grandma said that kitchens hold memories. And smells are like stories you can feel instead of read." Noah glanced at Ella, impressed. Lily sipped her cocoa. "I didn't mean to stay. I didn't want to go home. It's loud. And cold. And no one listens." Ella reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "Well, you can stay here for a while. Just today. We'll figure things out, okay?" Lily nodded, her eyes softening. For the rest of the morning, she sat at the counter, drawing on napkins with a pen Ella found in her apron pocket. She drew cakes with wings, bread that could sing, and a giant cookie shaped like a bear. Customers came and went, each one glancing curiously at the quiet girl, but no one asked questions. That was the thing about Fernville. People respected silence when it came from a place of softness. When the afternoon came and the rain returned, light as a whisper, Lily curled up on the cushioned bench by the fireplace and fell asleep. Noah watched her for a moment, then said, "You know, the bakery does feel different today." Ella looked up from kneading dough. "How so?" He thought for a moment. "Fuller. Like it grew a little more heart." Ella didn't answer. She just smiled. Outside, the drizzle turned into mist. Inside, there were warm lights, the scent of cinnamon, and the slow, steady sound of breath from a child asleep by the fire. The rain hadn't let up for days. Outside, the cobbled streets shimmered beneath the constant drizzle, and tiny rivers ran through the cracks between the stones. The bakery had become a glowing haven, its lights spilling golden onto the wet pavement. Inside, warmth wrapped around everyone who stepped in. The scent of vanilla, cinnamon, and melted butter lingered like a comforting hug. Clara had started setting up a small table by the front window. It was just a quiet spot with 2 chairs, a lace runner, and a small vase with fresh sprigs of lavender. She called it the window seat. Most customers didn't think much of it, but for some, it became something special. A little space to pause and let the world move on outside while they stayed still with a warm croissant in hand. That morning, a young woman entered, soaked from the rain. Her hair clung to her cheeks, and her coat dripped steadily onto the floor. She looked lost, tired in a way that went beyond sleep. Clara offered her a towel with a soft smile and led her gently to the window seat. "Would you like something warm?" Clara asked. The woman nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "Tea? Please. And maybe something sweet." Clara returned with a pot of rose petal tea and a warm raspberry tart. She set it down and disappeared behind the counter, giving her guest's face. The woman stared out at the rain, hands wrapped around the teacup. For a long time, she didn't speak. Just watched the world blur through the glass. It wasn't until an hour later, when the bakery had grown quiet again, that the woman approached Clara with a hesitant smile. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have paid earlier. I needed to sit. Thank you for letting me." Clara shook her head gently. "You needed the tea more than I needed the coins." The woman's eyes welled up. She wiped them quickly, embarrassed. "My name's Eloise. I used to live here. I haven't been back in a long time." Clara nodded, sensing there was more behind the words but not pushing for it. Eloise came back the next day. And the next. Always to the window seat. Sometimes she read a book. Sometimes she just sat. She didn't always talk, but Clara never minded. A gentle rhythm formed between them. Clara would bring tea and pastries, and Eloise would leave a note or a flower or sometimes just a smile. Other customers began noticing the little table. Some asked if they could sit there, but Clara always reserved it quietly for those who seemed like they needed it the most. One afternoon, a small boy named Theo came in with his grandmother. He had a loud voice and restless energy. But when he sat at the window seat, something shifted. He watched the rain with big eyes, and his grandmother told him stories about when she was little. Clara brought them warm apple cider and chocolate chip cookies, and the boy's laughter filled the shop. The next day, Eloise returned and found a drawing tucked under the vase. It was of a girl at the window with stars in her eyes. In shaky letters, it read, "Miss Window Girl." Eloise smiled. For the first time in weeks, she laughed. The window seat had become more than just furniture. It was a place of pause, of reflection. A quiet sanctuary for people who needed time. Clara never advertised it. She didn't put a sign or take photos for social media. But somehow, people just knew. If you needed it, the window seat would be there. Later that week, an older man with a worn hat and a cane stopped by. He didn't order anything. Just looked around and asked, "Is it still there? The table by the window?" Clara nodded and guided him gently to it. He sat slowly, his hands trembling as he placed an old photograph beside the vase. It was of him and a young woman, laughing in the same seat decades ago. "I brought her here," he said softly, "before she got sick. We watched the rain together, just like this." Clara placed a fresh cup of chamomile beside him and left quietly. The window seat remembered things. Not in the way people did, but in the way warm spaces carried stories in their walls. Some memories lingered in the steam of the tea, or the crumbs on a plate, or the silence between raindrops. Clara started keeping a small journal behind the counter. She called it the window book. When people left something behind, like a sketch, or a pressed flower, or a note, she added it to the pages. Not to invade their privacy, but to keep their stories alive. Eloise, Theo, the older man, all of them became part of the quiet history of the bakery. And as the days rolled on, so did the rain. But inside, beside the glass, stories were being baked into the air just like the cinnamon rolls and honey scones. Some customers returned often. Some only once. But no one ever forgot the window seat. It wasn't about the view. It was about being seen. One night, long after closing, Clara sat there herself. Rain tapped gently against the glass. She held a warm mug of cocoa in her hands and opened the window book to a blank page. Then, with a small smile, she began to write. For the ones who paused. For the ones who healed slowly. For the ones who didn't need to be fixed, just seen. And outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and soft, like applause from the sky. The rain was gentler that morning, a soft drizzle that misted the windows of the bakery like a fogged dream. Nora stood at the window with her coffee, watching the droplets slide down the glass. The quiet hum of the world outside seemed to mirror the calm inside her heart. She had started to enjoy these gray mornings. They were no longer signs of gloom, but invitations to slow down and breathe. She had found a rhythm, one that matched the gentle beat of rain on the bakery roof and the quiet heartbeat of fresh bread rising in the oven. As she sipped her coffee, the door creaked open. It was Luke. He held something in his arms, a square, cloth-covered item with worn corners. Nora smiled at him as he stepped inside, brushing droplets off his coat. "What's that?" she asked. Luke grinned, setting the object down on one of the wooden tables. "A gift. Well, sort of. Found it in my attic when I was looking for old recipe books." He pulled back the cloth to reveal a vintage record player, scratched but still beautiful, and a stack of dusty vinyl records. Nora's eyes lit up. "Does it still work?" Luke nodded. "I tested it. Thought your bakery could use a little music. Something warm. Something that sounds like butter and honey." They spent the next hour cleaning it up, carefully placing the first record on the turntable. A soft crackle filled the room, followed by a gentle jazz melody that seemed to stretch like velvet over the wood-paneled walls. It changed the air. The music curled into corners of the bakery that had never known melody before. It was like a warm scarf thrown over the shoulders of the room. Nora laughed as she moved behind the counter, her steps falling into rhythm with the beat. Luke leaned back against a table, watching her. "Feels like the past came to visit," she said, her voice light. Luke nodded. "It's strange how something old can make a place feel more alive." That afternoon, customers noticed. The man who always ordered a double espresso stayed longer, tapping his foot. The older woman who read novels by the window closed her book and just listened. Even the children, usually busy with their pastries, paused to sway to the music. The bakery had always smelled like cinnamon and cream. Now it sounded like stories. In the lull between customers, Nora and Luke sat at the corner table near the window. The rain picked up again, a steady rhythm that played in time with the vinyl. Luke looked over at her. "Do you ever miss the city? The pace, the people?" Nora thought for a moment. Sometimes. But I think I was always searching for something quieter. Something like this. He smiled. I understand that now. She leaned forward. Why did you really come back, Luke? He hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. At first, it was just grief. I couldn't breathe in the city anymore. Everything reminded me of my mom. But then, when I came here, I started to remember who I used to be. Before the rush. Before the world told me I had to be loud to matter. Nora's voice was soft. And do you feel like you matter now? He looked around the bakery. At the music playing. At the soft light. At her? Yes, he said. I do? They didn't need many words after that. The music filled the spaces between them. The record spun, the rain fell, and the bakery breathed in a new kind of magic. That evening, before closing, Nora lit a few candles on the tables. Their flames flickered gently, reflecting in the rain-kissed windows. Luke flipped over a new record, and the sound of a slow piano filled the room. They danced. Quietly, like people who weren't trying to impress, just feel. The bakery had become more than a place for bread and coffee. It had become a space where silence was honored, where the past was remembered, and where hearts, once fractured, learned how to hum again. And as they danced, the world outside blurred behind a curtain of rain. The music played on, and the little rainy day bakery glowed softly, like a lantern in the storm. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The world outside looked as though it had been washed clean, trees glistened with droplets, puddles shimmered like quiet mirrors, and the sky carried that delicate post-rain hush, as if the earth itself was taking a long, slow breath. Inside the bakery, Nora stood in the kitchen dusting flour across the wooden counter, lost in the gentle rhythm of kneading dough. Each fold was meditative, each press of her palms a quiet affirmation of this life she was slowly falling in love with. There was something about the way bread came to life, how it rose after resting, how warmth transformed it. It reminded her of herself. Luke hadn't arrived yet. He usually came in by sunrise, but the clock was already tiptoeing toward mid-morning. As she waited, she found herself reaching for a small box in the corner of the counter. It was old and faded, a collection of recipe cards that had belonged to Luke's mother. He had left them with her a few days ago, saying maybe she'd want to try one someday. She sifted through them slowly, the handwriting soft and swirling, smudged in places with grease or sugar. Each card felt like a whisper from another time. Her fingers paused on one in particular. Vanilla almond morning loaf, for the rainy days. There was a little heart drawn next to the title. Nora smiled. She pulled out the ingredients, humming softly to herself. As she measured and mixed, she noticed something curious, notes scribbled in the margins. Not just instructions, but memories. Luke always sneaks a spoon of batter when he thinks I'm not looking. Reminds me of rainy mornings when he was 5, curled on the kitchen floor with his toy trains. The more she read, the more the recipe cards felt like a journal, love letters hidden in flour and butter. A mother's quiet way of recording life, one cake at a time. And then she saw it. Tucked between two cards was a folded paper that wasn't a recipe. It was older, ink faded to a dusky gray. It was a letter. The top read, simply. For Luke, when he finds his way back. Nora's breath caught. She held the letter for a moment, unsure. Then gently, reverently, She placed it aside. This wasn't hers to open. But she felt the weight of it, the tenderness that had gone into its writing. A message meant to find its place, someday. The door opened. Luke stepped in, his hair damp, coat flung over his shoulder, cheeks flushed from the morning wind. "You're late," Nora teased. He grinned. "Stopped by the lake. Needed a little stillness." She nodded, then walked over and pressed the folded letter into his hand without a word. Luke looked down at it, his smile fading into something softer. He didn't ask how she found it. He didn't need to. He just sat at the window table and opened it slowly. Nora gave him space, returning to her dough, pretending not to notice how still he'd become. Outside, the sun broke through clouds, laying a soft gold light across the floorboards. Minutes passed. Then Luke stood and walked over, letter still in hand, eyes glistening. "She wrote this for a future she wasn't sure I'd ever reach," he said quietly. Nora wiped her hands on her apron. "But you reached it." Luke looked around the bakery. "I think this was what she wanted for me. Not just baking, but peace. A slower life. Something that felt real." Nora nodded, her voice gentle. "You're building it, Luke." He smiled faintly and placed the letter on the shelf above the counter, near the vinyl records and the old recipe cards. A quiet shrine of memory and meaning. They spent the rest of the day in a soft kind of silence, baking, serving, sharing glances that didn't need words. Customers came and went, many commenting on the new loaf Nora had baked. "What's this one called?" asked a man in a gray coat, sniffing the warm slice. Nora smiled. "Vanilla almond morning loaf." He took a bite and nodded. "Tastes like someone put comfort in a cake." That evening, as they cleaned up, Luke played an old record again. Nora leaned on the counter, eyes closed, swaying to the music. Luke turned to her. "You've changed this place, you know." She looked at him. "No. I think it changed me." The bakery was quiet except for the soft music and the hum of the oven cooling down. Rain hadn't fallen all day, but the sky held that weighty hush, as if the clouds were resting. And high above the shelves, among recipes and memories, the letter stayed. Not hidden. Not lost. But finally, home. The rain hadn't stopped. It had now become a rhythm. Not just a drizzle or a downpour, but something in between. A constant, patient tapping on the bakery's windows and rooftop. As if nature itself had fallen into step with the heartbeat of Rose Hill. Clara arrived at the bakery early, unlocking the door just as the sky turned from deep violet to muted blue. The town was still asleep. Not a single footstep or bicycle wheel passed by. Only the sound of rain and the distant hush of wind brushing across damp rooftops. Inside the bakery, the warmth greeted her like an old friend. The smell of lingering vanilla, the touch of flour dust on the counter, the soft creak of the old wood floor beneath her boots. She hung her coat and tied her apron, then stood for a moment, still, breathing, letting the silence soak into her before the oven hummed to life. Today, she was baking cinnamon rolls. The kind that took their time. The kind that needed patience, warmth, and heart. As she kneaded the dough, her mind wandered to the note she had found the night before. A customer had slipped it into the suggestion box near the door. It had read, "Your cinnamon rolls saved my week. I was having the hardest day, and somehow, That one bite made everything feel softer. Thank you for reminding me that small things matter. There was no name. Just the message. Clara had sat on her stool for a long time after reading it. It wasn't the first note she'd found like that, but each one hit her differently. There was something about knowing the comfort she sent out into the world actually landed. Like a pebble dropped into still water, causing ripples she couldn't always see. As the rolls rose and the first aroma of cinnamon filled the room, the bell over the door rang softly. Morning, came a familiar voice. It was Oliver. He was early, holding a book under one arm and his camera hanging from his neck. I brought this for you, he said, handing her a small packet of tea. Spiced chai. I thought it might go well with your cinnamon rolls. Clara smiled, taking it gently. Thank you. Want to stay and try one when they're ready? He nodded, brushing rain from his coat. I'd like that. The two of them settled into a rhythm. Clara moved through her baking, and Oliver sat at the counter reading, occasionally glancing up to ask about her process. What makes your dough rise so well? He asked. Warmth. Gentle handling. And time, she replied. He grinned. Kind of like people. They laughed softly. The moment was light, but there was something deeper underneath. Eventually, she brought over a tray of warm cinnamon rolls. Steam rose from them like soft whispers, and the scent of brown sugar and spice filled every corner of the bakery. Oliver took a bite and closed his eyes. This is comfort, he said simply. Clara sat across from him, holding her cup of chai. I like making people feel at home, even when they're far from it. You do that, he said, meeting her eyes. You really do. For a while, they just sat there. No rush. No noise. Just the sound of rain and the softness of something unspoken. Then, as if sensing the quiet growing too loud, Oliver pulled out his notebook. I've been writing something, he said, a bit shy. About this bakery. About you. Would you like to hear it? Clara nodded, surprised. Of course. He read. Some places are made of walls and ceilings. Others are made of stories. The rainy loaf is made of moments, steamy windows, the sound of whisks against metal, and the quiet strength of a girl who puts her heart into every batch of dough. You won't find neon signs here. Just a soft glow, a welcoming smell, and the feeling that you've stepped into something slower, kinder, and more real. Clara was quiet. Her eyes misted. She didn't speak for a moment. That's beautiful, she whispered. It's true, he replied, closing the notebook. You built something more than a bakery. You built shelter. The rain outside seemed to nod in agreement. They cleaned up together, side by side, no longer strangers. Just two people who had found warmth on a stormy day. As Oliver left, he turned at the door. Do you think every storm has a purpose? Clara looked out the window, where the sky was still gray but no longer heavy. I think every storm brings something with it, she said. And sometimes, it's the people who walk through it with you. He smiled, and the door closed gently behind him. The cinnamon rolls continued to cool. And the storm, in its own quiet way, carried on. The rain had finally stopped. After 3 days of constant drizzle and fog, the sky had cracked open to reveal a soft, milky light. It wasn't exactly sunshine, not yet, but it was a promise. The streets of the village still glistened with puddles, and rooftops dripped in slow rhythms. But there was a hush, a stillness, that only comes after a long storm. Inside the bakery, the warmth lingered like an old friend. The ovens were humming. The scent of rising dough, melted chocolate, and roasted almonds filled the air. The wooden tables gleamed in the soft morning light, and the glass windows no longer wore a veil of mist. Clara stood behind the counter, her hands dusted with flour, her apron wrinkled but clean. She had risen before dawn, kneaded the dough, and watched it swell in silence. The storm had passed, but it had left something behind, something quiet and powerful inside her. As she prepared the display case, she paused at the last tart. The one with lemon zest and blueberries. It was her grandmother's recipe, and she had made it for herself today. Not to sell, but to remember. The bell above the door jingled, light and hopeful. In walked Mr. DuPont, his coat still damp at the edges. He looked more awake than usual. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat. Clara smiled. "You're early." "I couldn't sleep. I think the silence woke me." He took his usual seat by the window. The one he had started calling his corner. She poured him his tea without asking, and placed a still warm croissant on the saucer. He sipped and sighed. "You know, it smells even better today." Clara leaned on the counter. "I think it's the calm. The bakery's never this quiet." A few minutes later, Ella arrived. She had taken the long way, just to feel the air on her face. Her scarf was wrapped tight, and her boots were speckled with mud. "I didn't think I'd miss the bakery so much," she said as she stepped inside. "But I did." "You were only gone for 2 days," Clara teased. "I know. But it felt like longer." She went straight to the back and began her morning tasks, cleaning, prepping, slicing strawberries for the tart. Her presence was steady now, like the rhythm of the place. Soon after, the children from the school passed by, pressing their noses to the glass, pointing at eclairs and macaron. A few tourists wandered in, drawn by the sweet scent and the hand-painted sign out front. The bakery was alive again, but different, softer somehow. Like it had exhaled. Thomas appeared around 10, carrying a box of fresh eggs. He looked tired but content. "No leaks in the barn," he said proudly. "And the hens are back to their noisy selves." Clara chuckled. "That's good. I was worried." He handed her the box, and their fingers brushed. There was a pause. A small smile. "You look well," he said. "I feel clear." "Me too." They didn't need to say more. By noon, the bakery was full. The villagers had come not just for pastries, but for comfort. To sit together and talk about the rain, about how the river had risen and how the apples might come in early this year. There was laughter again, not loud or wild, but real. Miriam came by with her knitting, and sat by the window next to Mr. DuPont. She offered him a biscuit from her bag. He accepted. Luke and Sophie arrived with their baby, who giggled at the scent of sugar in the air. Sophie whispered to Clara, "We've decided to stay." Clara's eyes widened. "Really? We've missed it here. And there's no place like home." Clara nodded. She understood. As the day stretched on, the light grew warmer. The storm clouds were gone, and the hills beyond the village glowed with green and gold. The bakery, nestled at the corner of the cobbled lane, stood like a quiet heart in the center of it all. When evening came, Clara stepped outside for a breath. She looked at the sky, now streaked with soft pink and pale blue. A few birds darted across, free again. Thomas joined her. "You know," he said, "I never liked the rain much. But this time, it felt different." Clara nodded. "I think we all needed it." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "Are you happy, Clara?" She turned to him, the bakery behind her, the scent of lemon and warmth still clinging to her sleeves. "Yes," she said. "I am." He smiled. "Then so am I." They stood there for a while, in silence, watching the village settle into dusk. The bakery behind them glowed gently, a beacon of warmth and hope. A place where stories were kneaded into dough, where love rose slowly like fresh bread, and where even the storm had been welcome, for what it had washed away, and what it had left behind. The rain had passed. And something beautiful had begun.